When it comes to weapons in D&D, not all of them were created equal, and many are considered to be mechanically subpar. On top of this, the rulebooks don't provide us much detail on these weapons, leaving us to fill in the gaps of how our weapons look and feel. Due to this lack of information, I'd like to go through and examine all the weapons of D&D to answer: what is this weapon, both in history and in D&D? How is it different from the other weapons available? And does it need to be made better, and how can we do so? For today's video, let's look at a versatile polearm with a devastating reach: the Glaive. When it comes to these history breakdowns, so far they've been relatively straightforward. Most weapons had some variants, but could easily be traced across history and cultures. Polearms, specifically ones beyond the basic spear, are where things are going to get a bit tricky, especially in Europe. As I mentioned in my short sword video, applying modern weapon classifications to historical weapons requires a little wiggle room, as there may be weapons that fall into multiple categories, weapons that are both a category and a weapon, weapons that go by different names in different languages, and changes to a weapon's definition over time. For example, the 1983 science fantasy film Krull calls this weapon a glaive, even though it operates and looks more like a shuriken or boomerang. The glaive we're going to be talking about is a pole weapon, with a single-edged blade approximately 45 centimeters long and a pole measuring about 2 meters. Some glaive variants also employed a small hook on the dull side of the blade in order to engage mounted foes better, though these are referred to more as guisarmes than glaives. Glaives were primarily an infantry weapon, and like many polearms, were very effective against mounted foes. Used for both cutting and thrusting, its long reach allowed warriors to strike opponents from a relatively safe distance, utilizing sweeping strikes to disarm or incapacitate enemies, and thrusting attacks to penetrate armor. The glaive traces its lineage as a polearm back to ancient farming tools, specifically the scythe. As with many other weapons throughout human history, peasants with little means who were conscripted into armed forces would often bring the tools that they had around their farm, such as scythes and billhooks. Over time, the effectiveness of these impromptu polearms, coupled with advances in smithing, would allow weaponsmiths to redesign them for war, starting around the 11th century. The first of these developments in Europe is believed to be the war scythe, a repurposed scythe where the blade is reforged to be at a 90-degree angle at the end of a long handle. These war scythes were a common sight during peasant uprisings in the 14th and 15th centuries, and were most famously used by Jan Žižka's Hussite warriors who rebelled during the Hussite Crusades. Outside of Europe, polearm developments would create weapons such as the Japanese naginata, the Korean woldo, and the Chinese guandao. Historical records suggest that the name glaive may have originated in Wales around the 15th century, due to mention of a warrant from the reign of Richard III for the production of 200 Welsh glaives. However, weapons that bear a heavy resemblance to the glaive were referred to by the early French as fauchard, whereas the Russians called it a sovnya. While the glaive was a popular weapon option, it also held ceremonial and cultural significance in Europe and Asia. Represented in many European manuscripts and artwork, the glaive was adopted as a ceremonial or ornamental weapon in the Renaissance era, with artisans exaggerating its size and weight until these ceremonial glaives became too impractical to use on the battlefield anyways. Further east, Luo Guanzhong's Romance of the Three Kingdoms stated the guandao was invented by the famous general Guan Yu during the early 3rd century AD. He alone was able to wield his immense green dragon crescent blade, which was said to weigh around 40 kilograms, fighting for the forces of Liu Bei until his execution by Sun Chen in 220 AD. While it's highly unlikely that this Guandao actually existed in the Three Kingdoms period, it became cemented in the legacy of Guan Yu, who is still worshipped to this very day. While polearms were kept in armories across the world, much later than other medieval weapons, the introduction of the flintlock musket in the 17th century was the final nail in the coffin for the glaive's use on the battlefield. In the modern era, the glaive is a popular sight in historical martial arts, games, and can even be found in modern military use. In contemporary wushu, derived from the Shaolin martial arts, the Guandao is still in use today, though it's primarily used to disarm opponents or deflect attacks. In historical European martial arts, while the glaive isn't as popular as other polearms like the halberd, it does still pop up from time to time. Most surprising of all, the Chinese PLA border guard, stationed on the border between China and India, are equipped with the Guandao, due to a 1996 agreement between India and China where no firearms are allowed near their border. Outside of those instances, the glaive remains a common polearm in gaming, being found in the Dark Souls series, the Dynasty Warriors series, and of course, Dungeons & Dragons. In D&D, the glaive is described as a long wooden pole mounted with a sword-like cutting blade. As two-handed melee weapons, they had a longer reach of 10 feet compared to other melee weapons, but found difficulty in attacking foes adjacent to the wielder. In prior editions, the glaive would cost between 6 and 25 gold pieces, weighed from 2.7 to 4.5 kilograms, and dealt 1d8 or 1d10 damage depending on the edition. In 5th edition, the glaive costs 20 gold pieces, weighs 2.7 kilograms, deals 1d10 slashing damage, and has the heavy, two-handed, and reach weapon properties. As the first of the reach weapons we'll be covering in the martial weapons category, the glaive is a good weapon on its own, allowing users to deal 1d10 damage from up to 10 feet away while taking up both hands to do so. The heavy weapon property makes the glaive unwieldy for small races like halflings and gnomes, but beyond that, it's still a very good martial weapon. However, look a couple slots down on the weapons table, and you'll begin to see where the problem lies. The halberd, another martial reach weapon, has the exact same stats as the glaive. There's not even a weight or gold difference. They're essentially the same weapon. With the pike, you can at least see the trade-off considering it weighs a hefty 8 kilograms, but there's quite literally no difference in whether you choose a glaive or a halberd as a melee weapon option. So, does this make the glaive a bad weapon? No, it just makes it a little bit redundant. For the regular reach weapons of the glaive, halberd, and pike, they're all equally viable for medium-sized races, and provide a more unique playstyle when compared to the other weapons we've covered in this series. On top of that, they have some of the best synergy with optional feats like Sentinel, Polearm Master, Slasher, and Piercer that can make a level 4 fighter feel extremely overpowered. However, with how stripped down the mechanics of 5th edition are regarding weapons, there are no mechanical reasons to use a glaive instead of a halberd, since they're basically carbon copies of one another. So, the glaive isn't a bad weapon on its own. It's just a little redundant with some of the other reach weapons. This is really becoming a bad trend with the martial melee weapons of 5th edition. When it comes to characters wanting to fulfill a certain roleplay idea with their weapon choice, having two weapons be exactly the same would normally be fine, since players can use either the glaive or the halberd and still be viable in combat. However, despite how effective it currently is, I want to take a look at some ideas on how we can give the glaive its own identity, to make it more than just another version of the halberd. My first suggestion on how to fix the glaive is to restore its improved critical hit effects from 3rd edition. In 3rd edition D&D, the glaive was a two-handed melee weapon that dealt 1d10 slashing damage. However, if you rolled a critical strike with a glaive, instead of doubling your damage, you would triple the damage. Now, in 3rd edition, the halberd also had this feature. However, there were other differences that set it apart that I'll go over when I get to the halberd in its own video. Giving the glaive this ability not only adds extra rewards for critical strikes, but if only given to the glaive, it sets it apart from the pike and halberd by increasing its damage potential. The one negative to this, just like when I suggested this on the battle axe, is that tripling the critical damage on a glaive could be a bit too unbalanced for 5th edition. Dealing 3d10 slashing damage as early as level 1 can trivialize some low-level encounters, especially when paired with the weapon's reach. That being said, I still feel like being able to pull that off would do nothing but add more fun to the game, and it does require rolling a natural 20 to do so. My second suggestion on how to fix the glaive would be to add Pathfinder 2nd Edition's expanded critical effect that they have for polearms. In Pathfinder, when a critical strike is rolled with a weapon, that weapon's group adds an additional effect onto the attack. For polearms, this effect moves the target 5 feet in a direction of your choice using forced movement. Considering that the glaive is already so good mechanically, having a critical effect that just adds a bit of utility to the weapon helps it stand out a bit, without adding on to the insane damage that it already does on critical strikes. Plus, this means that a lucky crit at the right time can push an enemy out of cover, get them out of range from being able to hit you, or even send them rolling off a cliff or into a bottomless pit. My third and final suggestion on how to fix the glaive is to add a hook action that is inherent to the glaive. Much like the guisarmes we discussed in the history section, these hooks could be used to attempt a disarming action against their opponent, allowing users to sacrifice a damaging attack to remove an opponent's weapon from up to 10 feet away. You could even combine this disarming strike with Polearm Master's ability to make an opportunity attack when other creatures enter your reach, removing an opponent's weapon right before they reach you. These added options would give the glaive more tactical maneuverability on the battlefield, and allow players who use the glaive to do more than just deal damage. Much like when I suggested this for the flail, the downside of this suggestion is that it overrides the Battlemaster's disarming attack maneuver. However, disarming attack allows the fighter to add their superiority dice to the damage while using whatever weapon they prefer, whereas the glaive's disarm maneuver would sacrifice a damaging attack to remove the enemy's weapon, and requires the use of the glaive specifically. So, the Battlemaster maneuver would remain the better option for disarming foes, but you still have an alternative for characters that aren't playing a fighter. All that being said, these are just a few of my own suggestions on how to fix the glaive. At the end of the day, it's still a perfectly usable weapon as is, but it just doesn't have any personality or flair when compared to the halberd. By adding in options like the ones I suggested, players can have more mechanical reasons to use the glaive specifically, allowing for a wider variety of character builds which make the game more fun and engaging. With that, we come to the end of today's video on the glaive. An interesting polearm, the glaive is a bit redundant in 5th edition when provided alongside the halberd. By adding in some options that can make it stand out, the glaive can go from just another 1d10 reach weapon to a polearm that can disarm foes from a distance, all while dealing extra damage on crits. What I want to know is, what do you think of the glaive? Do you think it should stay as it is now? Did you like some of the suggestions I put forward, or did you have your own ideas on how to make the glaive a more unique weapon in D&D? You can let me know down in the comments, or you can discuss it on the Alt Roll Discord using the link in the description. If you want to support Alt-Roll, you can visit our Ko-fi link in the description to leave a one-time or recurring donation. And make sure to like, subscribe, and hit that bell icon to be notified when our videos go live. However, that's all I had for you. Thank you all for watching, make sure to have a great rest of your day, and I'll see all of you next time.